I'm Suzanne Hurton Roberts. I want to welcome everybody to our April WAPA meeting. We have a wonderful program for you, and it's all due to Robert Winthrop's efforts and ideas. So I want to thank Robert, and I'm going to turn it over to him. Robert?
Yeah, I am.
Hey, thank you, Suzanne. So it's my pleasure to have the role of introducing Dr. David Jenkins from the Bureau of Land Management this evening. And part of my interest in inviting David to speak is that I spent 15 years pulling an oar in the lower galley of the Bureau of Land Management headquarters in Washington, and in the division that David, now in the socioeconomics program, which tucks within the division that David oversees. And the topic that he's decided to speak on, against efficiency, why we cut trees and what happens when we do, is one that I think will be of interest to everybody here and speaks to a number of anthropological and policy concerns. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about our speaker, just a little bit about my perspective on the Bureau of Land Management in about 3 minutes, which really helps suggest why this is such a timely talk, and then introduce his talk with a few questions, which I've also posted on the chat. So Dr. David Jenkins is a cultural anthropologist and assistant director for resources and planning at the Bureau of Land Management. I'll come back to that formal role in a minute, at the U.S. Department of the Interior. Prior to joining BLM, he held several management positions at the Forest Service and spent 5 years at the Office of Subsistence Management at the Fish and Wildlife Service in Alaska. He has a really startlingly broad research and teaching experience in anthropology and coupled human and natural systems, and has worked all over the place in Peru, India, China, Japan, Canada, and the US. His publications span a range of topics, and I've cut this down here for practical reasons, including myth, kinship, exchange networks, environmental values, endangered species, subsistence fisheries, and the use of mathematical models in anthropology. David Jenkins received a Ph.D. in anthropology from Brandeis in 1998 and has taught at MIT, Bates College, and the University of Southern Maine. His books include the forthcoming Nature and Bureaucracy, The Wildness of Managed Landscapes, from which this talk is adapted, and the novels Love Me, which came out in 2017, and Chthonia in preparation, which suggests Lovecraft, but I'm not sure, which he publishes as DB Jenkins. And when he's not doing all of that, he is an active mountaineer, rock climber, ice climber, backcountry skier, and whitewater kayaker. So personally, I'm exhausted, but he seems to be fine. So I'm going to take just a couple minutes. I'm sure David has his own, may want to say something about BLM on his own, but I want to say just a little bit about the agency. So this is little known. If you don't live in the West, you probably never heard of the Bureau of Land Management, or BLM, within Interior Department. If you live in the West, you probably have. It manages, when I last looked at figures, somewhat over 20% of the entire US land base west of the Mississippi, from the Arctic Ocean to the Mexican border, and across an extremely wide range of uses, from wilderness and recreation to a wide range of primary commodity production: oil, gas, coal, timber, which you will be talking about specifically, and so forth. So to bring this just a little bit of an ethnographic gaze to the BLM, when I used to work at BLM, most recently we were near the Nationals ballpark in Washington. And on the fourth floor they sometimes refer to themselves as the black hats, but anyway, the lands and minerals people who did oil, gas, coal, and other hard rock mining, uranium, copper, and so on, as well as all sorts of lands transactions. On the fifth floor where I worked, we had what I refer to as the impediments plus natural resources. That is, at various times when things got heated at the headquarters, the fourth floor people would refer to programs on the fifth floor such as air quality, water quality, wildlife, fisheries, cultural resources, wild horses, and worst of all, planning as kind of the impediments to properly letting the flow of commodities go forward. And appropriately enough, if you happen to look at an organization chart on the BLM website, you'll see the three operational directorates, and the two main ones are the one David heads, resources and planning, which includes not only the impediments, but also renewable resources, such as renewable if they are sustainably managed. That's, I think, part of the point of the talk, such as rangelands and forestry. And then the minerals group. So we have structured in the geography of the office, fourth and fifth floors, in replica, the key tension between, as well as lots of good relations between those two programs. And I'll just say as one last point on this, that like every other federal agency, BLM is always desperate to put its story before Congress. Around budget time, this is around that time, we would trot out, and our socioeconomics program would work with public affairs to produce a lovely brochure, The Sound Investment in America. And I'll just show you a front bit of the most recent one, which looks backwards to me. Why is that? Anyway, the point is that it is relatively easy to use economics to make estimates of the value of programs such as oil, gas, and coal, and forestry, and so forth, commodity programs. And it is not impossible, but far more difficult and less convincing, in a sense, to make economic estimates for the value of clean air, clean water, intact fisheries habitats, and so forth. So that kind of brings us to the topic, I believe, that Dr. Jenkins is going to speak on. As I said, the title is Against Efficiency, Why We Cut Trees and What Happens When We Do. And the summary we have is, drawing on decades of experience as an anthropologist and federal land manager, David Jenkins argues against bureaucratic efficiency, focusing on timber and timber harvests. He considers the past century of forests, wildfires, and organizational change, and traces the evolution of efficiency, in quotes, from a 17th century technical measure to a 20th century moral attribute. He then dips into soil science and samples policies of the atmosphere and concludes by finding value in inefficiency. I don't know if we're going to have to destroy the tape of this program afterwards, but finding value in excuse me, inefficiency defined simply as taking the time to think, which I think is a beautiful statement. And earlier in our correspondence, I posed 3 questions that suggested to me to David, and I'm just going to read them now and then relinquish the mic. So those were, in what respects, if any, does your perspective on efficiency reflect your training and experience as an anthropologist? Second, given that you define inefficiency as simply taking the time to think, is this a teachable skill? And third, given your wide experience in both academia and federal land management, can you suggest strategies for incorporating such perspectives into more utilitarian academic programs, including forestry, business administration, and even economics. So, Dr. David Jenkins.
Robert, thank you very much for not only your questions and your introduction, but your riff on the BLM. And I like the idea of impediments, by the way. I think that's an interesting way to think about socioeconomics and the sciences involved with those. I'm here actually to speak to you not in my official capacity. I'm here to speak to you as an anthropologist who's happened to work for about 12 years now in federal bureaucracies. And I want to tell you a little bit about how I think about that experience and how my sense of anthropology informs what I do and how I think. And I want to also suggest that there's a really interesting challenge for those of us trained in the social sciences to work within a bureaucracy. And I think I'm going to talk a little bit about what I see as those challenges. But I want to talk about several things. I want to talk about bureaucracy. I want to talk about that in order to set the scene for how I'm thinking about timber and the Forest Service and timber harvests. And then I'll come back to some of these points at the end of going through the history that Robert suggested I'm going to speak to. But I want to start by suggesting to you that one of the prominent concerns facing scientists and policymakers and environmental activists and environmentally concerned citizens is to recognize that human influence in the natural world is pervasive and has a very long history, and to act accordingly, or to choose not to act. What I mean is Western style management of nature mediated by economic rationality and state bureaucracies may not be the best strategy to maintain environmental integrity. The question for me, as I've worked in bureaucracies, is what kind of human influence, conceived of in the widest possible sense, will produce ideal environments for future generations? And the next question, which is particularly salient in a democracy, is who gets to decide on a course of action? And I'm going to place modern bureaucratic culture and function smack in the middle of these questions. We may be in the age of total bureaucratization, as the anthropologist David Graeber has argued. But bureaucrats, me, and others who work in bureaucracies, don't entirely control our cultural meanings, nor our messages, nor the mix of cultural and natural systems that I call our wild gardens. People call these mixed cultural and natural systems or coupled human and natural systems, but I like to think of the combination of nature and culture as a wild garden. So my question to start is how should we describe and analyze the synergies of human and natural systems? When we talk about trees, we're talking about people. And when we talk about people, we're talking about trees, or at least that's what I'll endeavor to do in the next hour or so. And I'm going to suggest that government bureaucracies are particularly important in defining that mutual influence between human and natural systems, with a range of consequences, some of which are intended and a lot of which are not intended. And I've approached this problem of analyzing the mutual influence of human and natural systems from two broad perspectives. The first is as an objective scholar, investigating bureaucracies and natural systems from the outside. So I worked in different parts of the world looking at different governmental organizations and their relationships to the natural world. So that's one perspective I bring to bear. And the second is that over the last 12 years, I've have the perspective of an inside practitioner working in a bunch of roles in the federal system. I helped develop policies and regulations involved in the control of natural systems. But in both instances, as an outside observer or an inside practitioner, I've been guided by anthropologists and historians and sociologists and political scientists and ecologists to understand and demonstrate how bureaucracies are intertwined with natural systems. And I'm going to come back to that idea too, this broad-ranging sort of intellectual attempt to understand bureaucracies, because Well, I'll get to this in a minute, but I'm just going to presage it by saying, if we are on the age of total bureaucratization, as social scientists, we need to pay more attention to the function and structure of bureaucracies. If Graeber's right, and he's a strong critic of bureaucracies, it behooves us who work within bureaucracies to be as self-conscious as we can about the structure and functioning of those systems. So my key questions in this book that Robert mentioned are these. How do bureaucracies conceive of and consequently interact with forests, with water, with fish, with wildlife, and with humans? So pursuing these questions, it called for a description for me of what I call traditional bureaucratic knowledge. And first, this is a standard claim of bureaucracies, is that we understand traditional bureaucratic knowledge not through what bureaucrats say, but through what they do. So bureaucratic knowledge becomes visible in action. You know, if you're building a system of canals or cutting a forest in a patchwork pattern or using helicopters to round up horses on public lands or drilling for oil in the Alaskan wilderness, you can choose your example. Bureaucratic knowledge becomes visible in these kinds of actions. And remember, I'm speaking of public lands here. And Herbert Kaufman, many of you may know his work, in his classic study of the Forest Service made the same point. What he said was concrete actions add up to the sum and substance of Forest Service policy. Everything else is only intention. I'm going to say that again because I was always struck by how the economy with which he made that point. Concrete actions add up to the sum and substance of policy. Everything else is only intention. Action, however, is only part of the problem, or part of the issue here, and part of the story. And for me, it may be the least interesting part, action. It receives the most critical attention. So this generates my second claim about traditional bureaucratic knowledge. And I hope I can justify this claim as I go through the history of the Forest Service. I'm going to argue that bureaucratic knowledge is always uncertain because it resides between knowledge systems, in particular between economic and scientific and political and cultural knowledge systems. It resides between these systems and it's uneasy in its residence between those systems. It's not a monolith, can never be a monolith, although bureaucracies have come to dominate much of our social life. So Kaufman's dismissive only intention misses much, I'm going to argue, because intention flags social and cognitive phenomena that motivate behavior. And so they should be of interest to all of us, right? Planners and economists and non-governmental organizations and politicians and those of us who work in bureaucracies. Intention and motivations of behavior include things like symbolic systems, power relations, expressions of morality, concentrations of significance, and the general ongoing contestation of meaning. So I'm interested in that contestation of meaning and in that uneasy relationship between a variety of knowledge systems that I see in bureaucracies, but none of which entirely dominate the bureaucracies. And because I see bureaucratic knowledge as residing between these knowledge systems, I find sociologist Max Weber's pioneering work less salient than more recent scholarship. I think bureaucracies are considerably more mixed and considerably more mixed up than Weber imagined. But Weber identified common patterns in bureaucracies, in government bureaucracies and business bureaucracies and theocratic bureaucracies. And these bureaucracies have actually solidified their hold on us, as Graeber argues. And I want to mention 5 common patterns in part to argue against them. Weber is still taught all over the planet, and his ideas of bureaucracy still have some interesting hold on us, just like bureaucracies do. First, bureaucracy is characterized by what he called a rigid division of labor and by necessary chains of command, and are staffed with those that have certified qualifications. So this is one of his major claims here, right? Rigid division of labor, chains of command, certified qualifications. The result, Weber thought, is a self-perpetuating, hierarchically ranked organization resistant to change as certified experts become embedded in these chains of command. And bureaucracies that you work in, you can probably see that characteristic. Chains of command, certified experts, a fairly rigid division of labor. The second thing he says is that bureaucratic administration produces an optimal efficiency. I'm going to come back to this point. But he says an optimal efficiency for precision, speed, clarity, command of case knowledge, continuity, confidentiality, uniformity, and tight subordination. So optimal efficiency then becomes a transcendent cultural value, which is rarely questioned. And I'm going to get back to that because when I questioned it, I was met with such strong disapproval. So, third, predictability of rules is for a modern bureaucracy actually of primary importance. In other words, without predictability and without rules, bureaucratic administration would fail to reach the transcendent value of optimal efficiency, further frustrating those at the top of the chain of command. Fourth, he says, secrecy is used to sustain the power interests in a bureaucracy. Nothing, he says, is more fanatically protected by bureaucracy than the concept of secrecy is necessary. Okay. So here's my comment briefly. Fanatically protected secrecy may be a bureaucratic concern as those higher in the chain of command solidify their power by excluding others from decision-making. I also think that in public land management and in many functions of government, secrecy runs counter to public benefit and immediately sets up a conflict, which further implicates diverse knowledge systems. Fifth, for Weber, he says, unfailingly, a fully developed bureaucracy is always in a position of great power. And I think this is both true and overstates the case, as the recent history of the Environmental Protection Agency and the Department of Agriculture show us, whose power was greatly diminished under the prior administration. So not always in a position of great power, but frequently so. So what I'm suggesting is that the examination of the actual power knowledge systems at play shows that things are less efficient and much messier than the bureaucracy itself aspires to be. Let me make one other point about bureaucracy, actually two more points about bureaucracy. So as an outside scholar and as an inside practitioner, I've sought to maintain a level of objectivity in the work that I do. As many of us know, objectivity is not entirely possible in ethnographic research. A very large anthropological literature demonstrates this, but I've never been overly troubled by that demonstration. I've learned, nonetheless, that within a bureaucracy, for me to remain thoughtful, I have to remain marginal. I don't know if you all have that experience, but that's been my experience. I find as soon as I start using bureaucratic lingo unself-consciously, it's time to readjust my ethnographic awareness. Participant observation in anthropological research is one thing, becoming socialized is quite another. Working within a large bureaucracy carries its own challenges for any of us trained in the human sciences, and the way I best readjust my ethnographic awareness is through writing, and through fairly critical writing. But I've also, and I guess somewhat contradictorily, I've sought to ignore objectivity in the sense that some of my responses to working within a bureaucracy are personal, and I can't simply pass over this aspect of my experience. So I've included, as I talk about trees, a few of my responses, my personal responses, and because I want to provide a different sort of insight into working within a bureaucracy. But I should note, I've never been interested in making a work of scholarship about myself, directly or indirectly, but I have allowed in this work a bit more of my personal responses to emerge. I think it's important in part to counter what Weber called a fully developed bureaucracy. He says, such a bureaucracy embodies very specifically the principle of wealth without anger or frustration. He goes on to say, this specific character of bureaucracy means the complete eradication of love, hate, and all purely personal sentiment from administration tasks. But bluntly, he goes on, this means the eradication of all sentiments that are irrational and incalculable. Weber's vision, to me, appears to presage artificial intelligence, which, as we know, is characterized by instrumental reason and no self-awareness and even less emotion. But I think to understand a bureaucracy or to understand AI, we have to return to the human, not eliminate it. And this is why an ethnographic approach and not an institutional approach underpins my scholarly efforts. So I think that rather than eradicating sentiments, we really need to understand them, and even if they're constrained by the system in place. And then just one more point. There are, of course, as you all know, professional perils associated with writing about the very government bureaucracies that hire us. I'm challenged. I sometimes challenge managerial representations and question that this is the way things are, point of view. And I don't do so simply to critique. I do so because alternative perspectives, if they're ethnographic or historical or broadly comparative, provide basis for improvement. But I've found also by challenging established managerial representations, I'm typically met with one of three responses from my colleagues: mild interest, dismissive indifference, or puzzlement. On rare occasions, I've been told to keep my opinions to myself, which I tend not to do, as you can probably tell. But my hope is that those who are interested or indifferent or puzzled see value in continuing to challenge the status quo. So I tell my colleagues, public lands management requires understanding publics and lands, but not as separate categories of phenomena. They're thoroughly entwined empirically and should be just as thoroughly entwined managerially. And let me make one more point. Well, two, actually, I just said before I was going to make two more points, and I'm going to make three, not two. I'm going to suggest that the language of bureaucracy is like mud. It's turbid and it's unpalatable. And it's little wonder that language and the accompanying bureaucratic functioning appear alien to lots of people who, outside of the experts, who speak the jargon-filled language and are involved in the bureaucratic functioning itself. So esoteric, generally inaccessible bureaucratic knowledge forms the basis of administrative power generally, or at least that's what Weber argued. And we may see some of that in our own our own work that we do in various institutions that we work within. So I want to make one further anthropological point, and this is from David Mose from his Malinowski lecture from 2005, I believe. He worked a lot with non-governmental organizations and wrote a very fine book on bureaucracies in those organizations. But he says that that powerful institutions. Now, let me say this a little differently. Anthropologists are usually adept at analyzing the consequences of powerful institutions in their knowledge systems, which, to quote Mose, constantly organize attention away from the contradictions and contingencies of practice and the plurality of perspectives. So we say that again. Powerful institutions constantly move away from the plurality of perspectives because that plurality challenges the status quo. I'm going to give you some specific examples of how that plays out over time in the Forest Service. He also says that anthropologists and other social scientists who work within these powerful institutions need to find ways to, what he says, to negotiate space for their involvement to be more ethnographic and to resist institutional pressure to conform to dominant, policy-driven, or economics-based knowledge systems. So that's sort of my background of thinking about, very briefly, about bureaucracy. And if you want, we can pause there before I talk about trees. If you all want to talk just quickly about bureaucracy, its structure, its function, and my brief take on both of those.
You can either use raise hands or for a small group if you want to just unmute if you have a question.
I'm aware many of you work in bureaucracies, and as do I. And I suspect many of you thought about many of these issues or even critiqued them within your own contexts.
Emily. Emily has a question.
Has her hand up, I see it.
Yeah.
Hand up and microphone off. Sorry. Very interesting presentation. I enjoyed it a lot since I work in the area of policy planning, but not within a bureaucracy, but with bureaucracies. At any rate, you said at the very end that it's important to negotiate the bureaucratic space and through using more ethnographic approaches. And there are quite a wide variety of ethnographic approaches. I wanted to ask you, which are yours?
Well, I actually use an ethnographic approach depending on the context. I don't have a single one, but I think the point that Mos was making and that I'm trying to make is that what's important is what people are doing within these bureaucracies and not what the bureaucracies are imposing upon them. And I think that's the negotiation of ethnographic space that I'm interested in. Not the imposition of you know, a sort of Weberian non-human life, but what happens when we look at the foibles and the interests of the humans who staff these bureaucracies that we work within. I think that to me is the really interesting question.
That fascinates me too.
Yep.
Thank you very much for the response.
I think institutional approaches don't get at that ethnographic question. And I think that negotiation that Mos speaks of is because bureaucracies are driven by economics and they're driven by policy. So how do we carve more space out for a variety of perspectives and not just a couple of culturally dominant perspectives?
Robert, are you there? Why don't you just go ahead and ask your question? Robert has a question in the chat. Okay. So he says, having been a bureaucrat himself, it seems that the demands of bureaucracy as you go higher become stronger, like SES. And actually, I was thinking of that too. For example, the demands of avoiding diversity. I think you said that your way of recalibrating is to write. Any comments?
I'm actually going to address that a little further on, but yes, I think that the position of a senior executive, because it presumes some sort of political neutrality, requires a reluctance on senior executives to speak in ways that may go against the political status quo. Senior executives can be moved out of their position for any perceived political apostasy, and that may well result in folks being reluctant to speak. That's a hypothesis. I don't know that that's the case, but my guess is there's a reluctance to go against the political grain, and that reluctance may in fact increase the higher one moves through these bureaucratic systems. There's a presumption of political neutrality that comes with these senior executive jobs.
Mhm.
And so that's an interesting presumption. What do you do when you're faced with bureaucratic irrationality, for example? So I'll just leave that as a rhetorical question for right now.
Jana?
Yes, thank you, David. I teach in University of Maryland, and I worked as an ethnographer on a Smith Island, where trees and bureaucracy become very intimate in a sense that both represent real threat for people's very existence. The island is eroding. There's real. I would say every quarter of years, multiple trees die because of the erosion of the land. So it's a kind of community that's watching its own death by looking at the trees. And yet it was interesting to listen to you because it just seemed to me so familiar. I come from Czechoslovakia, and my first work that I worked on was about Czech political prisoners and the government during the communist regime. And it seemed to me that everything you say could just easily fit to what I write about, Czechoslovakia in 1950s, and of course there is the Kafka's secrecy, and I mean everything just seems like exactly same fit. But in this ethnographic context on a Smith Island, it is. I would not be hesitant to say that for people in the place, this sort of secrecy and an invisible bureaucracy represents greater threat than, for example, climate change. That in some ways they can see it's visible, or bureaucracy they don't, but it's scary. I'm just ranting now, but I wanted to say this more as a kind of a comment, and I wonder what you would say and how this, when you talk about ethnographies, resonates.
Well, when you were just speaking, it brought to mind the nuclear testing of weapons in the American West in the 1950s. And talk about a bureaucracy. What was interesting there was that the Atomic Energy Commission told folks, citizens in Nevada and Arizona, that fallout posed no danger whatsoever. They told employees, however, if you're in fallout, go indoors, wash, discard your clothing. But to citizens, they said, there's no danger. So this to me is a real extreme example of a bureaucracy, of a government thinking that its Cold War policies were more important than the lives of the citizens themselves, who were lied to, directly lied to. So, there are problems in bureaucracies when they're not straightforward and honest with its citizens. In a democracy, it's very different, I think, than in communist countries. But the secrecy, as Weber said, and I think he was probably right, is a signal feature of bureaucracies, and they maintain their power through that sort of secrecy. I don't know if that directly addresses your question, but Jana, that's what I thought of when you raised that the 1950s question. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. I'd like to read your work, by the way. It sounds really interesting. What you're referring to.
It's called Czech Political Prisoners, and it's on Amazon. It was published by Altamira.
Okay, thank you.
Suzanne?
Hi. I was a longtime resident of a large federal bureaucracy, the NIH. And I just wanted to note that sometimes having a large, difficult to move bureaucracy can be a good thing. There have been a few times over the years that I was at the NIH, over the years when I worked in the federal government, where there were political factions that would, from the outside, that would really try to interfere with some work that was being done, that was good work of the bureaucracy, that had good aims, good outcomes that we were seeking. And the idea that you have all these rules, all this red tape, all these layers, that slows people down who want to come and totally dismantle something that's being done for the public good. So I understand, and I mean, yes, I've thought about Weber a lot over the years. But the idea that the bureaucracy is self-replicating, self-preserving, is a double-headed sword, I guess. It can be constraining. On the other hand, it can protect some functions that are important.
And you're absolutely right. And I worked in the context of China and Japan and India and the United States, looking at the various government bureaucracies and how quickly China can make changes versus how slowly the US makes changes. So you're absolutely right. There are vast differences in political meddling in the systems involved. You think of the CDC before it became politicized, for example.
Yeah.
So I understand what you're saying, and I've watched it play out differently in different countries.
Right.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
I worked on a wetlands in China that was drained for agriculture, and then the Chinese said, "Oh, that was a mistake," and they turned it back into wetlands.
Oh, no.
Right on the Russian border. So, it could happen. It happens really quickly, but in the US, that would take 20 years.
Yeah.
First to drain it, and then 20 years to try to put it back into a wetlands form. So yes,
Right.
You're right about, there is an advantage to having that slowness, and that gets back to my idea of inefficiency and the need to think carefully about what we do. And when I talk about trees, I'm going to illustrate that a little bit more.
Okay, thanks.
Yep.
I don't see any more questions.
Okay, great. Let's move to trees then. And this is sort of a complicated story I'm going to try to tell here. I'm going to break it into smaller sections. I'm not going to tell you the entire story because it's very long, but I want to highlight some of the things. Let me start with this. In 2017, when I worked for the Forest Service, I pitched to a group of 40 or so Forest Service leaders the idea of and the importance of inefficiency. We had assembled in Ohio near the Wayne National Forest to talk about trees, of course, talk about trees. And we were there because the Forest Service had been charged by the Trump administration with increasing national timber sales by 15%. But existing bureaucratic timber harvesting processes were seen as getting in the way of that goal. So then the call was to make those processes more efficient and increase the sale of timber on federal public lands that we manage. So policy here yields implementation. This gets back to Susan's question, right? So how quickly does this happen? Policy yields implementation. It's simple. That's the political cause in this model, generating empirical results. And we even had a wonderful phrase, which was turned inevitably into an acronym to guide our efforts. The phrase was environmental analysis and decision-making, EADM, E-A-D-M, and it's pronounced EADM, like the cheese. So the initial bureaucratic battle was won, and those who devised policy were delighted. We had environmental analysis and decision-making. Let's speed things up. Let's become more efficient. But the on-the-ground implementation, the cutting of all those trees, remained to be seen. So the primary bureaucratic obstacle to the plan to cut 15% more trees appeared to be the National Environmental Policy Act, which was passed during the Nixon administration. And this is the law, as you all know, that requires environmental assessments or environmental impact statements for proposed federal actions, such as timber harvests, which have environmental consequences. And the purpose is to analyze and then avoid or mitigate negative effects of actual timber harvests. Okay, so this was one obstacle. The second was another act, the National Historic Preservation Act, passed in the mid-1960s, which some in the timber world saw as improperly slowing timber harvests. Now, the National Historic Preservation Act requires surveys of cultural significance. It insists, really, that we chart historic and prehistoric evidence of human occupation prior to any disturbance of federal land. So, as with NEPA, the National Historic Preservation Act requires us to avoid or mitigate negative effects of timber harvests. So in the Ohio meeting, I had the temerity to stand up and point out that the National Environmental Policy Act and the National Historic Preservation Act were acts of inefficiency. They require us to stop and to think. They require us to act only if we've carefully thought about the consequences of our actions. And I argued that the American public, through its Congress, wanted us as federal land managers to take the time needed to adequately analyze our actions, and that by becoming efficient, in many ways, curtailed our thoughtfulness. Hence the need for inefficiency. It was, in my argument, the consequence of thoughtfulness. My colleagues, as you could imagine, responded with a circus of complaints. Without doubt, they said, we need to be more efficient. There's always room to improve our bureaucratic processes. Let's not get in our own way. Let's not be our own worst enemy by remaining inefficient. And in reply to the circus of complaints, I remarked that we'd turned efficiency into a fetish. And with all fetishes, we'd overlooked important details. I asked, what were we hiding with our quest to be efficient? What powers were involved? What was lost? Who, after all, got to make the decision at what level of the organization? So my effort that day in Ohio, in front of those 40 leaders of the Forest Service, was to gently question the collective wisdom. Maybe I shouldn't have said fetish, but the point I raised bears some scrutiny because of the multiple negative reactions to it. Apart from using anthropological jargon, I'd violated a norm of some sort. I'd questioned what was held to be obviously true. I'd come out against efficiency. So I can imagine my colleagues, they didn't do this, but I imagine them doing this, banging the side of their head in disbelief. You know, bureaucracies are famously inefficient, despite what Max Weber told us. And the rules and regulations and the insistence on rules and regulations in the face of contrary evidence seem to characterize all bureaucracies and not just those involved with public lands management. And I'm aware of a large and growing scholarly literature that's critical of bureaucratic force and culture, and a literature that demonstrates the failures of bureaucratic thought. And I've actually contributed to that literature. Bureaucracies and those who become enculturated within them can be stridently implacable and goofily officious. I often bang my own head in disbelief. But let me explain my argument against efficiency. I'm going to wind through a century of forests, a talk about wildfires, a little bit about organizational history. I'm going to follow efficiency, as Robert mentioned, as it transforms from a technical measure to a moral attribute. I'm going to talk about soil science and atmospheric policies. And then I'm going to find value in inefficiency after all of this, and give us some hope for thinking about efficiency, and even, as Robert suggested, finding ways to talk about and educate younger folks in university who are interested in careers in land management or other sorts of bureaucratic agencies. I need to start, however, with Gifford Pinchot, the first chief forester of the United States, to understand my concern for EDM, environmental analysis and decision making, to understand why I argued against speeding up timber sales, why I argued against bureaucratic efficiency in the Forest Service. I really need to start with Gifford Pinchot. I'm going to tell you a little bit about Pinchot and 3 or 4 other early chief foresters and how they set the scene for forest management through the next century, and even still into the modern era. Their efforts are still salient, I think. So Pinchot, was the chief of the U.S. Division of Forestry, and then later, some 7 years later, became the chief forester of the U.S. Forest Service. He was trained in German forest management, in France actually, but German forest management, and instilled in the Forest Service a sense of mission. He promoted a rational, scientific, efficient management of timber harvests on public lands. And he insisted that timber professionals and not politicians, going back to Susan's point, not politicians should run the program. If politicians got involved, efficiency would disappear and the process would become corrupt, he argued well over 100 years ago. But he said forestry is tree farming. To grow trees as a crop is forestry. So he extolled the virtues of scientific forestry, and he managed to keep out other concerns. For example, big game management on public lands, or those concerns associated with a nascent late 19th and early 20th century cultural movement favoring a spiritual relationship to nature and not a utilitarian one. Pinchot, however, recognized the value of nature, and he was interested in forestalling the commercial exploitation of forests, and instead looking toward a way in which we could manage public lands in perpetuity. He often said he was interested in the greatest good of the greatest number in the long run. And that idea contained a strong materialist orientation, measurable in board feet and not in spiritual relationships to the natural world or the necessity of wildness. And this phrase, let me just make an aside, this phrase was coined by Jeremy Bentham in 1776. John Stuart Mill later picked it up. Pinchot added in the long run. In a letter to the Secretary of Agriculture, in which Pinchot was given this job, Pinchot wrote his own letter of hiring at that point. And this is where this phrase occurs. I asked folks in the Forest Service, do you know where this phrase come from? And they say, oh yeah, Gifford Pinchot wrote it, made it up. Not recognizing the much longer intellectual history of this utilitarian bent. It really was coined by Jeremy Bentham a couple of centuries before. But Pinchot's greatest good utilitarian vision was this. It was to ensure forests remain in the public domain, but as working forests. And this was eventually realized. As you probably know, Theodore Roosevelt came into office after a president was assassinated. He was a buddy with Pinchot, and together they shifted the 60 forest reserves in 1905 to 150 national forests with over 172 million acres by 1910. This was a huge shift in public lands at the time. And again, Pinchot was interested in maintaining these forests in perpetuity, but that went against the industrialists of the day. William Clark, he was a senator in Montana, for example, the richest man in Montana, said in 1903, he said, those who succeed us can well take care of themselves. He was interested in the total exploitation of the natural resources. That was the other side of the effort at the time in the turn of the century. And Pinchot was interested in not the preservation, but the use of, in perpetuity, of forests as working forests. So he was interested in efficiency, functionality, simplification, and monetary worth, and he raised all of these to high status. And he effectively pushed out other values at the time. So the sorts of values that I mentioned just a few minutes ago. So he was aware that future generations depended upon his efforts. He was keenly aware of that. And he was in office for about 10 years. He was ousted in the Taft administration over political differences. Henry Graves became the second forester. And this is the time in 1910 to 1920, where the real commercial exploitation of national forests began. He called for what he referred to as lumbering for use. And he opposed this to agriculture, in which forests were cut down and trees were discarded as a nuisance. Instead, he said we need to cut trees and sell them for profit. He called it lumbering for use. The problem that became evident right away was that lumbering for use resulted in major forest fires. Clear-cutting forests, the most efficient way to cut a forest, resulted in not only the cut over part burning, but the adjacent non-cut parts burning. And this is the period where these massive forest fires began, and they began in a direct relationship to lumbering for use, to timber harvesting. Now, this is one of those interesting contradictions of the time, right? Fires directly came out of human activities, lumbering activities at this time. So 2 mistakes stand out, both accentuated by the next chief forester. The first mistake was allowing the industry to capture regulatory control of the Forest Service lands. Clear cutting became prominent. So that was the first mistake, allowing industry regulatory control of public lands and allowing extreme commercial clear cutting on national forests. The second mistake, which we all know about so well now, is of extreme fire suppression, which continued throughout much of the 20th century and into the late 20th century, and now we're hearing it again. Let us suppress all these fires before they become catastrophic. So influential timber professionals and industry and government folks all insisted on suppressing fires. And here's a twist that I find really interesting in bureaucracies. Suppressing fire also had the effect of suppressing the science showing the ecological importance of fire-adapted landscapes. So it wasn't only fire that was being suppressed on lands, it was the science investigating the importance of fire in landscapes. So Greeley pushed hard to actively suppress research on fire-adapted landscapes, even though he knew throughout the South people burned landscapes, and he wrote about it. He says, farmers and loggers and turpentine orchardists all fired the woods. They set fires to green up the forage, to uncover oak and beech mast for their hogs, to clean out litter before boxing pines for rosin, to open up the brush for better hunting, or to get rid of cattle ticks or chiggers or snakes, or just because the woods had always been burned now and then. So he was keenly aware there were cultural practices in the South of yearly burning of landscapes, of forests, but he was convinced fire was the enemy. He said, fire prevention is the #1 job of the American forester. The first and greatest commandment of American forestry is to keep fire out of the woods. Eternal vigilance is still the price of forestry. Fire was the enemy. There is some historical irony here because Greeley established in 1916 the scientific research branch of the Forest Service, much of which was dedicated to the study of fire. So the enemy, fire was the enemy. If you think fire is the enemy, how do you combat it? It required real-time discovery of fire and an infrastructure which would allow the rapid mobilization of a firefighting crew. So Graves and Greeley, these 2 early chief foresters, put the Forest Service on a path to building an infrastructure appropriate for the suppression of fire. So roads, trails, communication facilities. Right? So this real-time discovery of fire was further promoted by the 5th chief forester, a guy named Ferdinand Silcox, who initiated in 1935 what he called a 10 a.m. policy. So any fire spotted had to be put out by 10 a.m. the following day, right? No matter how remote or how large the fire. So how do you achieve that goal? The Forest Service scrambled to build lookout towers, to build roads and trails, to ensure that any fires were extinguished as quickly as feasible. And eventually over 8,000 lookout towers sites were established, located in every state except one. You can imagine which state did not have a forest fire lookout tower. Was Kansas. Every other state had lookout towers, right? Just Kansas didn't. So with real-time discovery of fire and with appropriate infrastructure, I'm going to return to this infrastructure idea in a minute, the suppression of fire began in earnest, and it continued in earnest. The Forest Service became not the service that cut trees, it became the agency that fought fire. So the fire historian Stephen Pine remarks of the Forest Service, I think this is interesting. From its origins, fire control was not just something the agency did among its various tasks. More than anything, fire was the reason the agency existed at all, and it became the primary index of the agency's success. So it became the Forest Service became the premier wildland fire agency on the earth. So one contradiction, which I think borders on the absurd, is that within the agency, suppression of fire was accompanied by the suppression of knowledge about fire. Whether raised by scientists or the public, where any discussions of fire in forests, if at odds with the prevailing orthodoxy, were to be ignored or disputed. Suppression of fire and suppression of knowledge about fire were not absolute, however. Intentional burning was allowed in some southeastern forests in the 1930s and 40s, supported actually by the Forest Service and other research, which indicated the importance of fire in longleaf and loblolly pine forests. But the Forest Service nonetheless kept its own science and its own practices hidden as best it could. And at first it did so by ignoring entirely early science. There was a researcher named Chapman whose work was published between 1909 and the early 1940s, which indicated the importance of fire for the health of forests. And second, the Forest Service refused to let intentional burning occur anywhere except in southern forests, with a few exceptions. So, as I said, the Forest Service kept hidden its own research, started in 1916, which eventually became known as the Ecology of Fire. So again, this is, to me, an absurd part of a bureaucracy. Suppress fire, suppress knowledge that would call into question your suppression of fire. So this is an extreme example, to me, of where an imagined order of the world, an imagined order of the natural world, organizes the effects of a bureaucracy, the efforts of a bureaucracy. Everyone imagined that fire suppression was a good thing. And that imagined order, as I say, organized the major effects of the Forest Service as a bureaucracy. And those who thought otherwise, those whose research or cultural experience pointed to fire as important to the health of the landscape, were overlooked or they were marginalized. So one historian, Ashley Schiff, says that for zealous technocrats, purpose was transformed into a mission and a campaign, into a crusade. Fire was the enemy. Just as another historian who have talked about the progressive era in terms of a gospel of efficiency, Schiff also recognized something of the doctrinal and unquestionable nature of Forest Service fire suppression. She says, thus, evangelism subverted the scientific program, impaired professionalism, violated canons of bureaucratic responsibility, undermined the democratic faith, and threatened the piney woods with ultimate extinction. It wasn't until the 1960s that ecological considerations came to the fore, including the idea of the importance of fire as a natural process. So let me pause just for a second and make a couple of points about forestry. At the time, was equated with silviculture. The result was ecosystems were simplified into systems of harvesting and growing trees. So throughout the first half of the 20th century, most rangers working on national forests received the same sort of training. They'd also been thoroughly socialized through effective means of centralized bureaucratic oversight. They saw their jobs as managing trees, bringing trees to market, regenerating forests with desirable species, suppressing fires, and mitigating damage to insects. Those were the main things that forest rangers did in the first half of the 20th century. So they simplified the world. They simplified forests in this way. And they invented techniques of forest inventory and control and devised a language of standardized forestry techniques. And they participated in the growth of an agency, the Forest Service, that rewarded, according to the fire historian Stephen Pine, compliance, promoted shared values, and developed a culture of conformity. So forest simplification became the model for managing natural forests, and organizational simplification became the model for managing humans, managing those forests. So let me return just briefly to roads and trails and give you a concrete example here. In Washington and Oregon, in the national forests in Washington and Oregon in 1930 and 31, over 20,000 miles of roads were planned. And by 1936, 75% had been completed. Trails were also important. 85% of the planned 35,000 miles of trails were completed in the national forests in Oregon and Washington by 1936. Why were there tens of thousands of miles of roads and trails? It wasn't for administration, it wasn't for recreation, it wasn't to get easy access to hunting. It was to get to that, what became that 10 a.m. policy, to get as quickly and as efficiently to any point on a forest where a fire may start. I've yet to see a systematic ecological assessment of the consequences of all those linear structures on all of our national forests that happened almost simultaneously. Tens of thousands of miles of trails, tens of thousands of miles of roads across all of our natural forests. I think there is a really interesting ecological history to be had just looking at those two sets of linear structures and the consequences for fragmenting the natural world. And that happened at this time, and it happened because there was the need to efficiently put out fires. Okay. Speed was everything. Efficiency was the mantra. So by the 1960s, the Forest Service, with its adherence really to market rationality and solutions of market efficiency, in the 1960s, a shift occurred because the transcendent value of market efficiency was opposed by another transcendent value, which came out of the environmental movement, in which the preservation of environments was more important than their exploitation. So environmentalists began to shudder with despair about what was going on at the time. And what was interesting here is in the 1970s, a new Forest Management Act was organized and written up, spearheaded by Senator Hubert Horatio Humphrey in Minnesota. Some of us remember Senator Humphrey. So his act, the National Forest Management Act, limited clear cutting, required national forests to develop a management plan. This was only started in the 1970s, to have a plan of a forest. Otherwise, it was just, it was really catch as catch can. Let's cut trees and see what happens. So it wasn't until the 70s that a plan was required for national forests, which prohibited timber harvests if reforestation couldn't happen or start within 5 years. So if you were going to cut, you couldn't do it unless you could reasonably foresee regenerating that forest beginning in 5 years. The act also required careful analysis, and it required taking into account fish and wildlife. It reiterated the importance of the National Environmental Policy Act, and the emerging science of ecology was the prime mover. Scientists were key players, courts and citizens had important roles to play. The act was not easily ignored, but the Forest Service ignored the act. Citizens complained, scientists conducted studies, courts intervened, and the Forest Service was required to change its timber-centric practices. It wasn't until 1991 when a federal court told the Forest Service to pay attention to the 1976 Act. It took that long. And between 76 and 91, the Forest Service continued its timber-centric practices until a federal district court said, cut it out. This court said that the Forest Service had a deliberate and systematic refusal to follow the act. And the Forest Service officials refused to comply with laws protecting wildlife. And so in 1991, timber-centric Forest Service practices finally came to an end. So my pitch for inefficiency going forward a few years, 2017, was really a pitch or a mild caution to remember past sins. We were asked to cut 15% more trees, and I was saying, oh, wait a minute, let's think about efficiency before we delve into cutting more trees. The timber-centric Forest Service was a thing of the past. Simplified industrial forests as models for management had become complex forests once again, with ecosystem management the rallying cry. So I mentioned my pitch for inefficiency was met with, well, it was not met with enthusiasm. Let me put it that way. It was met with some complaint. But I want to now move out of the Forest Service just for a moment and talk about the history of this notion of efficiency. I think this is really quite telling because it gets at something that becomes, well, culturally paradigmatic. It becomes so culturally salient that to question it is perilous. So bureaucratic thought tends to mimic economic thought. It's forever seeking efficiencies and developing measures of value, which become sources of value. So here's this hidden, there's something hidden in all these fire suppressed forests. And what it is a more intricate cultural and historical context needed to understand efficiency and why it became valorized. So the question I'm going to ask here is, how did a notion from engineering, first clearly articulated about the mechanics of water wheels, come to characterize so much of social life? So one mid-19th century definition of efficiency is this: the ratio of useful work done to energy expended. The ratio of useful work done to energy expended. This comes out of physics, right? It doesn't come out of sociology, it comes out of physics. So the term and the idea of efficiency entered many realms of human life, human thought and activity. Here's a few examples of efficiency that this notion entered: mechanical efficiency, organizational efficiency, household efficiency, economic efficiency, industrial efficiency, educational efficiency, personal efficiency, leisure efficiency. Even leisure was subject to notions of being efficient. All were increasingly scrutinized to eliminate waste, minimize the energy expended, and increase the useful work done. So technical experts became key players and offered advice on improvements in a variety of mechanical and social domains. Progressive era advocates like Pinchot and Graves and timber and other landscape professionals insisted that we had to become efficient in all of our techniques to exploit our natural resources, or at least stand back and watch the experts at work. Efficiency is celebrated. It's also a deeply troubling idea, according to historian Jennifer Alexander. So the celebratory side of efficiency has infused the Forest Service, and the troubling side is not. So what is going on here? So in the turn of the century, Henry Ford's production lines, Frederick Winslow Taylor's organizational methodology, Alfred Marshall's theorizing in his 1890 Principles of Economics, all of these were about efficiency. And Alexander's effort is to show efficiency's many guises and uses, and to ask how a certain objectification and a certain morality, this is what I'm interested in, a certain morality became attached to efficiency. So the efficient and the good came closer to meaning the same thing in these years after the turn into the 20th century than any other time in American history. The efficient and the good. One's a technical measure, the other is a moral evaluation. But increasingly, I'm going to argue the distinction seemed lost. Efficiency became culturally prominent. Efficiency soon came to describe diets, appliances, child rearing, education, clothing design, exercise, saving money, curing neurasthenia, and global dominance. Efficiency itself became a prominent feature of advertising, from motors to soaps to breakfast foods. It appeared in daily newspapers, in home economics journals, mechanics magazines. It was plastered everywhere by 1915. Headlines, advertisements, editorials, business manuals, and church bulletins all proclaimed efficiency is so tremendously important. If you needed help chewing food, efficiency experts offered advice. If you pined for freedom, efficiency was the path. If one wanted to build muscle or strengthen resolve, it was time to start with efficient self-discipline. If one hungered for love, one could take a self-test to gauge one's personal efficiency, and you had to measure the results, because without a metric, judging efficiency was only a guess. Let me read to you one widely read theorist that provided moral grounding for great personal efficiency. He says, efficiency is the difference between wealth and poverty, fame and obscurity, power and weakness, health and disease, growth and death, hope and despair. Efficiency makes kings of us all. Only efficiency conquers fate. Efficiency leads us from a world of chance to a realm of choice, changing us from automatons to men. Efficiency provides our only freedom, that of shaping circumstances and hewing events to suit ourselves. So whether people hewed events or hewed trees, the measure of efficiency became a source of moral authority, a guide to behavior and belief, and apparently to good health, if not good governance. So measures of efficiency could be improved, new techniques may be invented, but here efficiency took on a morality, so it became problematic to argue against the idea of efficiency. So the efficient and the good bound together became one. Inefficiency and waste, similarly bound together, became one. And I think the symbolism is as clear as it has proven, and simple as it has proven long lasting. Let me just make a really quick aside. You know, if you read Forest Service documents, for example, the 2012 Forest System Land Management Planning Final Rule, over 114 pages, the word efficiency occurs 58 times. So efficiency is referred to, and it characterizes a diverse set of quite different administrative functions: frameworks, processes, responses, designs, prioritizations, adaptations, resolutions, costs, management. All are distinct. All are subject to efficiency. All functions are made to seem equivalent through recourse to efficiency. If you read these kinds of government documents, you recognize that efficiency is plastered everywhere still, a century after it first achieved cultural prominence. So avoiding waste is universally, ubiquitously implied. Embracing the good, its symbolic counterpart, is thus unavoidable. So little wonder, with more than a century lauding efficiency in so many domains, my pitch for inefficiency was unworthy of consideration. My pitch, in effect, was immoral. I'll return to that point. So I reminded this crowd of Forest Service leaders that for some environmental problems, for some proposed sales of timber, there are no clear paths forward. Even the experts may be stymied. So scientific information or understanding may be incomplete. It's often the case in complex ecosystems. Policymakers may be unable to divine the issue clearly. Why cut 15% more trees? We were never told. We were just told that we needed to do it. Policymakers may have no interest in really talking about the issue or defining the issue, simply commanding the result. And stakeholders and environmentalists and lumber mill owners may articulate widely divergent opinions on what are called in Forest Service documents desired conditions. I always ask, well, whose desires and what conditions? And resource managers with their hands, who have the real responsibility for managing real environments may have their hands tied by political appointees following the unpredictable results of presidential elections. So complexity and uncertainty often render public decision-making contentious when thoughtfulness and inefficiency should be going hand in hand. And I was concerned, and I was convinced at the moment, that the flip side, that is efficiency, was going to lead to an inadvisable rush to action. And I was concerned we were headed in a headlong rush. And so I continued to contend at this group that efficiency limits choice by insisting on a subset of behavior and belief germane to the task at hand, and then by exclusion, insisting that other behaviors and beliefs don't belong. I suggested to this group of Forest Service leaders that we had become hell-bent on efficiency and on efficiently using efficiency in a way that made our larger goals irrelevant. The Forest Service may have all been cutting trees and growing industrial forests, but our lands and our publics have changed. Our human desires have changed. Our managed landscapes have changed. Our economies have changed. Our publics have changed. Our laws have changed. Our sciences have changed. Conditions have changed. And in this meeting, I briefly mentioned my fondness for fly fishing, which is a lovely way to immerse oneself in nature, but must be the least efficient means to fish humans have ever invented. A weir and a spear would efficiently catch trout on the small streams I favor. My casting often did not. My point was about the beauty of inefficiency, not easily quantified, but it was also slowing down the rush to cut more trees. I thought about mentioning that speed reading was a craze when I was in high school, a means to make reading more efficient, but it had the effect of missing much of the content and nearly all the nuance of a written work. Speed timber sales are the equivalent, or the ecological equivalent to speed reading. So one young leader took the microphone and he said, efficiency was the only way we could possibly function. And my suggestion was the height of foolishness. We were charged with increasing timber production. Our own processes should not get in the way. Inefficiency, bah, he said. A fetish, humbug. This rising leader was deeply offended by my remarks. It became clear that he adamantly contested my claims. I had come up against the classic philosophical risk of ostracism based on ideas that challenge conventional wisdom. So this is the risk that we take when we stand up in a group of our peers, other leaders, and say, oh, wait a minute. Are you sure this is what you want to do? Are you sure you're all right? Now, being an anthropologist working in land management bureaucracy over a decade, I now and then question its constructs. I try to hold at arm's length for inspection our theories of cause and effect and function. And I wonder out loud how, when, and why our curiosity fails to be replaced by collective acquiescence. And I always seek to combine social and natural considerations in all of our decisions, because I want to avoid the unhelpful notion that there exists some sort of natural world outside of and independent from humans, much as I dismiss the opposing, equally unhelpful view that human beings are all that matter. Some members in the meeting tolerated my comments. They'd listened to my approach for many years, and they had soon returned to their forests of concern, isolated from regional and national influences, and they would do whatever they could to keep cutting more timber. My proposal for them appeared truly nonsensical. So I want to pause just for a moment and see if I have some more questions or some more comments that we could work through. We've been engaged for a long time here, Martha. So I just expressed a lot of different ideas. Maybe we can take a pause.
Well, maybe Rob or one of the people using his whatever screen name, but it says perhaps we should make a distinction regarding bureaucratic efficiency between internal efficiency and accomplishing the organizational objectives with the least wasted effort, which would be good, with external efficiency, narrowly using efficiency as the main criterion for defining the organization's objectives, frequently bad. It is Rob himself, so why don't you chime in and, make sure I got that right. That's any Rob, you want to, or do you have any comment on what's in the chat, David?
Yes.
Well, okay, I had just heard Robert pop in.
I'm sorry, I'm switching rooms here. Should I restate my question? I was envisioning my own experience working in a bureaucracy, and at times, which we've all had, I think, the kind of the eye-rolling sense, not of the wisdom of the fundamental objectives we're pursuing, but just simple inefficiency of getting things that we agree on done. Like just the normal conventional sense of poorly organized. I'm calling that internal efficiency. You have a set of objectives, good, bad, whatever, just getting how much time does it take to do them versus what I think you're talking about, David, is what I'm going to call external efficiency, defining the objectives of defining the tasks of the organization by very narrowly using efficiency as the key criterion. Is that a distinction worth making, or is it not work that way?
Well, I think it's a distinction worth exploring. I think what I'm trying to get at is the uncritical acceptance of efficiency as a way of managing an organization. And the reason I think it's an interesting phenomena is that people don't question it. They say, of course we should be efficient. Of course this is the manner in which we should work. Of course we should avoid waste. And what I'm trying to suggest is that of course is something that's not plumbed. And I'm trying to plumb that of course. Where did the notion come from? Why should we be so efficient? What are we hiding when we're efficient? What are the consequences of that sort of efficiency and so on? So even though if you agreed on shared goals, it is important to get something done. The question is, are you agreeing on shared goals? And what's the path toward getting those sorts of things done? And in pursuing that path, what else are you ignoring? So I think that's part of what I'm trying to understand here with this history of efficiency and the forests. I don't know if I quite answered your question, Robert.
Yeah, no, David, I think you did. I don't want to belabor the point, because what I'm really saying is, maybe if I said it more clearly, everybody would say, well, that's obvious. It's just, use BLM as an example because I haven't worked in any other government organizations, but I found, to me, the headquarters worked in two modes. One where there was a very clear, just as a place where things are supposed to get done, work is accomplished for the paycheck. There were those projects which were clear priority, and then I found BLM to be actually extremely efficient and all hands on deck and so on. Sage grouse planning in the 7 years ago or whatever. And then there was kind of the default, which was sometimes mind-bogglingly inefficient. And I'm just talking about workflow here. I'm not talking, this doesn't actually touch the much more serious questions you're raising, but I think the many people hearing your eloquent statement may first just assume you're advocating for general inefficiency of getting anything done at all, in the simple sense of management of work. And I think probably we don't need more of that in the federal government. I think we maybe have enough inefficiency.
So in this context, I'm asking, why cut 15% more trees? And what does it mean to be efficient? And part of what I'm suggesting, and I didn't quite get to this, is that the effort becomes internally bureaucratic. And it is not an effort that's really focused on the trees on landscapes or the consequences of cutting 15% more trees on landscapes. One of the issues was that there were insufficient lumber mills to accept all those trees. Forest Service started to cut trees and they stacked up, they piled up, they stacked up because there were no mills to process them. So to say efficient, then you have to think, well, efficient toward what end? In this instance, there was no economy to absorb all those efficiently cut trees because the administration didn't bother to ask the question, is there an infrastructure around that could absorb all those trees? So the efficiency that was presumed wasn't there, nor was the efficiency around cutting trees, which was focused on trees and not on ecosystems. That didn't sustain itself either. There was no real interest in the ecosystems. There was simply the interest in getting timber on trucks. So that was the effort to be efficient, was to get timber on trucks and to move them along. So what I'm suggesting is that went too quickly. It didn't allow us to think through all of the consequences. We didn't think through the economic consequences. And I heard forest supervisors say to regional foresters, we can't cut more trees. We don't have the staff to cut more trees, and there is no industry to absorb all those cut trees. So the bureaucracy turned in on itself and said, how do we become internally more efficient? It didn't look at landscapes and the consequences of cutting all those trees. It turned into itself. And I think when bureaucracies do that and turn into themselves and think about the efficiency of the bureaucracy, what's lost sight of is the consequences on landscapes themselves. This was the efficiency, this was the kingdom I called into question. That kind of internal looking inward to become more efficient rather than the larger picture. And that's what I called into question with that group of leaders. And they reacted in the way that I described.
Matt? That you behind WAPA DC?
Yep, that's me. Okay, so if I understand correctly, you're making the argument, and I think it's a valid argument, that we should consider decoupling the value judgment that goes along with the term efficiency. But it also seems that one of the problems that you encountered was that the term inefficiency is perhaps unpalatable to people that have not made that understanding of decoupling that value judgment. So with that in mind, have you considered alternative messaging? Have you considered other ways to frame it aside from the term inefficiency?
I've got a couple of responses to that. In the logic of sufficiency, Princeton argues that the ratios that are used to describe efficient practice themselves are contradictory. Depends on which ratio of efficiency that you're interested in, and which one becomes politically prominent. So even if we move towards something like sufficiency rather than inefficiency, and we look at ratios of energy expended to work accomplished, for example, then the question is, well, what work and which energy and in which system? I think the problem that I find is that the idea of a system here, of a natural system and a human system, and how they are connected together is difficult to maintain. The systematicity of it is difficult to conceptualize and maintain because of the moral component, because of the cultural component, which shifts away from that sort of notion of the system, away from the ratio of work, energy expended to work done. So your question about other ways of framing, there have been other ways, and they haven't really taken cultural hold. And so by framing it this way, and by trying to suggest that efficiency and good and inefficiency and waste became connected symbolically, I'm trying to point toward a cultural phenomena in the United States over the last century. And then we can get, Matt, to your question, how do you shift that? I don't know that an individual can very well, or even an organization can very well, but it can be self-conscious about how technical measure and a moral valuation become connected such that we forget that there's a difference between them. I think that has gone on with notions of efficiency equated with the good and notions of inefficiency equated with wastefulness. So, but that's a good question that you ask, and maybe others in our group have a possible response to it or a solution.
Thank you.
I don't think we've any more questions right now.
Okay, can I talk to you a little bit about atmospheric science and trees and carbon?
We have 20 more minutes, and we'll want to have 5 minutes at the end for goodbyes and questions, but we'd love to hear them. Just to give you some time frame.
Okay, well, let me just really quickly point out that the Anthropocene and that carbon shifts in the atmosphere are frequently blamed on the Industrial Revolution, and that's where we see a major human change in the carbon content of the atmosphere. The Little Ice Age is frequently cited by climate change deniers as an example of natural fluctuations of carbon in the atmosphere. But recent research shows that the Little Ice Age was probably strongly anthropogenic. And it was strongly anthropogenic in this way. When Europeans showed up in the Americas, their diseases over about 100 years killed 90% of the people in the Americas, most of whom were in the tropics and subtropics. There were some 60 million people in the tropics and subtropics. When their European diseases killed 90% of these 60 million plus people, their agricultural fields reverted to forests. The result of that was that the forest pulled more carbon out of the atmosphere, lowered the temperature, and it partially accounted for the little ice age of the 15th and 16th centuries. So this is a really interesting example of humans shifting planet-wide climate that precedes what we now talk about as the vastly more influential fossil fuel shift of atmosphere as carbon dioxide and methane gets dumped into the atmosphere and results in the greenhouse effect. And I think this is interesting for two reasons, mostly because when we think about forests, we can't think about forests in the story that I started with Pinchot 100 years ago. We have to think about forests over at least a half a millennia across the planet. And we have to think about forests in that way because of the anthropogenic shift of carbon that occurred 500 years ago. And if we're going to think about forests and we're going to think about carbon and we're going to think about climate change, we need to have a larger perspective than we do. Unfortunately, politicians have a very short attention span. Foresters have a longer attention span, usually in terms of rotation cycles, 40 years or 60 years or 120 years, depending on the tree species. But I'm suggesting when we think about humans and we think about forests and we think about carbon and we think about atmospheres and we think about policies and we think about bureaucracies, we need to really make an effort to think longer and larger and more inclusive than we tend to do, especially those of us who work within bureaucracies and work on very small portions of the natural world in some way or another, as I do. So let me just make that suggestion to us all. When we think about carbon, when we think about atmospheres, when we think about our efforts in bureaucracies, we need to really have a larger focus, larger way of focusing than we do at the moment. So I can stop there and we can have more questions. And then I won't talk about soils.
If we got questions, maybe we have a few minutes for soil.
Let's get them.
Robert, you're the winner tonight.
I'm so interested in David's talk, I can't stop myself. David, thank you for a very interesting presentation. I'd like to just reiterate one of the questions I posed at the beginning, and maybe you would care to run with this. And that is, given that you define inefficiency as taking the time to think, is this a teachable skill? And if so, what should we do to teach it?
Well, it's pretty clear to me that folks in science take all the time they need to think, and some scientists don't keep working on problems for 20 or 30 or 40 or the entirety of their lives before they come up with a solution. But I think your question is more immediate than that larger sort of taking the time to think. How do you get folks to recognize that within our political and our bureaucratic and our social systems that thoughtfulness is necessary? And I don't think that's a hard thing to teach, that thoughtfulness is really quite necessary. I don't know if we oppose that to this sort of, as you say, BLM or maybe American ethos of getting things done. Let's build a canal and then figure out the consequences later. Let's cut, 50,000 acres of trees and, oh, sorry, spotted owl, let's see what happens to you next. I think that we have so many examples in front of us of our failures to think that getting people to be more careful in their thought about ecosystems and the relationship of humans to ecosystems, I don't think is a hard go. I think the hard go is once people get into bureaucracies and become socialized into working within them and become in which questioning is not a prominent value, in which pushing the margins of the status quo are not is not valuable. I think that's the real difficult start, Robert. And I've been telling folks for the 12 years that I've been in bureaucracies, we need to hire younger people who are now trained differently than we were all trained, who have a different way of thinking about the environment, they have a different way of thinking about humans, and we need to bring them into the system and listen to them. Because this is their world that we're leaving to them, and they are going to, and they shouldn't be simply socialized into a bureaucratic mindset. They should come in and transform the bureaucratic mindset. I think that's, for me, that's the real challenge. How do you make that transformation occur? Because there are all sorts of things that preclude that. When you work within a bureaucracy, and including in my example, when I'm told to be quiet because my opinions are contrary to normalcy, right?
Thanks. Matt?
This might be kind of a continuation of Rob's question, but I guess my question is, how do you train inefficiency on a more local level? So for example, I am a data scientist for a group of people that everything is an emergency. They want it yesterday. Every change needs to happen now. And these are arbitrary deadlines that they're setting. I used to be an Army medic. What constitutes an emergency to me is somewhat different. And that's kind of my question, like how on a more local level can you get out this idea of inefficiency and taking your time?
Well, the way I try to get that to happen, two ways actually. Within my directorate, I'll speak now just about what I'm doing here. I give people the responsibility and the authority to make decisions. And coupled to that responsibility and the authority, I tell them I expect them to bring their best thinking to bear on whatever problem there is that they are working on. And that's my expectation. And I'm not going to tell them how to think or what to think. I tell them to think. And I say, if it takes longer than we anticipate, I will take that heat, because I want the best work that you can do when we are conceptualizing a policy or how to deal with drought or what to do with wild horses or so on. I want your best thinking. And what I do is I actually bring a lot of science to them that they're unaware of. And this is one interesting thing in a bureaucracy I've discovered here. I talk to people about, what science are you current with? What do you read? What do you think about? And many of them say, well, since I left school, I don't have time to think about current science. I don't have time to read deeply into the literature. So part of what I do is I say, well, I'm going to give you that time, because you need to know these things in order to do this sort of job well. So that's the sort of inefficiency that I try to promote from my perspective as a director, as a supervisor, as a leader in some fashion. Giving people authority, giving them the responsibility, and then insisting that they bring their best thinking forward. That's very different from triage, Matt, in a real emergency, right? So this gives us the luxury of thought, I think.
Thank you.
You want to do 5 minutes of soil?
There's a raised hand from, there's a raised
Oh,
hand
there's a
from Sydney
raised
Moore.
hand. I'm sorry. Sydney, please.
Yes, hello, Sydney Moore here. And I was struck by your phrase, bureaucratic mindset, because the company I'm currently working for is very set on the agile mindset, and they want to organize everything in terms of agile and Scrum and a certain perspective of how people are going to be organized. And I wondered if you were familiar with that, what you thought of it.
Well, I think this is a way of running counter to the Weberian notions of bureaucratic sclerosis, right? Of this really sort of closed bureaucratic structure. And I think that especially in the business world, there's all kinds of experimentation that's going on in order to do work differently. And I think that I applaud that experimentation. I don't see that sort of experimentation happening in government land management bureaucracies. They are very hard to shift in their orientation. But I do see that outside of those. And I think especially in business contexts, I see them. And maybe that's, Sydney, the context that you're referring to as well, that agility. People talk about it a little bit in government bureaucracies, but it's really hard to see the consequence where something happens quickly or there is an agile way to approach a problem, and it becomes very ponderous.
Thank you.
Yep.
All right, and any other questions? Seriously, David, do you want to give us a couple of final words, or?
Well, I can do that. Just one way to think. One of the puzzles that I had when I first worked for the Forest Service, and maybe this is more common than I know, but when I first started working for the Forest Service, everyone seemed to be asking the same question: how do we tell the story of national forests? And the question was posed by an impressive range of people, from the chief forester to all the deputy chiefs to the national directors of specific programs to regional forest, to forest supervisors to engineers and recreation technicians. Almost everyone was saying, how do we tell the story of national forests? And the question still circulates. And I was puzzled when I first heard it, and I remained puzzled by the fact that it remains unanswered. It remains unanswered. Everybody asks this question and nobody answers it. I began to think that the question unites everyone in the agency, and it's why it's never answered. It functions not as a question, but as an assertion of uncertain identity. And I don't know if this is common in other land management bureaucracies. I heard the Fish and Wildlife Service say something similar. I've heard the BLM say something like that. I don't know if the National Park Service folks say, how do we tell our story? But to me, for the Forest Service, the answer was really simple. The story is this: with good intentions, the Forest Service built a system to exclude fire from national forests. State and private landowners followed right along. The Forest Service also built a system to harvest trees from national forests, with uneven results over the last century. And as a consequence of past management mistakes, terrible mistakes, fire suppression was a huge mistake. Right? All the foresters thought fire suppression was the way to go. They all thought they were right, yet they were all wrong, right? So as a consequence of past mistakes, the forests we have inherited are overgrown. They're thick with flammable understories. And we now know that fire exclusion is a problem. We now know that plantation style industrial forests don't mimic natural forests. We now know that we need to manage for ecological function first and timber production second, and avoid large clear cuts. We now know that fire adapted landscapes are ecologically important and go a long way to secure communities near forests and to ensure that they're not consumed by wildfire. We now know the importance of forests in carbon sequestration, and in forestalling even more rapid climate change. We now know that we need to shift away from concrete and steel to timber-based construction and to burn wood and not fossil fuels for energy. And I had a long riff on that, but I won't go into the burning of wood versus coal. But now our management efforts are to thin and not cut down forests and to encourage and not preclude fire-adapted landscapes. Our timber production and our intentionally set fires are directed at long-term solutions to the problems caused by our ancestors. I call them our enemy ancestors. We see our efforts, our modern efforts, as experiments in land management, which will require constant adjustments as we continue to learn from the result of those experiments. Along the way, we invite everybody to help because we don't have all the answers. We also know through past and present experience of public lands management that this work is conceptually difficult. It's politically fraught. It's environmentally consequential. It's physically demanding, and it's labor intensive. And as it turns out, none of it is efficient. Thank you.
Thank you, David. And thank you, Robert. Suzanne had to leave, so I am going to do the honors of officially thanking you on behalf of WAPA. And I want to let people know that next month on May 10th, we will be having a panel of anthropologists who are also business owners. So we'll be back to the business of anthropology. I think it's going to be really, really interesting. So, and with that, I would be very happy to let you all go.
Thank you all. It's been a pleasure for me.
Thank you.